What if the internet was created decades earlier, but never set us free? Part 1. The ENIAC Network and the Dawn of the Copper Web. Chapter 1. The Great Acceleration of 1952. Imagine a world where the information age didn't begin with the sleek, silicon-based miracles of Silicon Valley, but with the hum of vacuum tubes and the clatter of telegraph lines. In our timeline, the 1950s were defined by the Cold War, a period where the greatest minds were focused on building bigger and more destructive bombs. But in this reality, a single realization in a basement at the University of Pennsylvania changed everything. The military planners realized that the true weapon of the future wasn't the force of the blast, but the speed of the data. They realized that connecting the electronic brains, the massive ENIAC and UNIVAC mainframes, was more important than any nuclear warhead. In 1952, the Federal Data Exchange was born. This wasn't the invisible, wireless internet we know today. This was the copper web, a physical, tangible network of thick cables and massive relay stations that began to stitch the world together while it was still black and white. Imagine walking down a street in 1955. The world looks familiar, the chrome-heavy cars, the fedoras, the neon signs, but something is different. On every street corner, there is a data kiosk. People aren't just reading newspapers. They are punching commands into heavy, mechanical keyboards, waiting for a ticker-tape response from a central mainframe hundreds of miles away. This was the birth of the analog feed, a world where the speed of information finally outpaced the speed of human thought. Chapter 2. The Vacuum Tube Web. The technology of this early internet was a masterpiece of brutalist engineering. There were no microchips. Instead, there were millions of glowing vacuum tubes, each one a fragile, glass heartbeat of the network. This vacuum tube web required massive infrastructure. Entire buildings were dedicated to housing a single web node, cooled by giant fans that could be heard blocks away. But despite the bulk, the impact was immediate. By 1958, the first personal terminal was introduced. It was the size of a refrigerator and cost as much as a small house, but it promised something revolutionary: the ability to send a telepacket to anyone else on the network. Think about the psychological impact on a society that was still getting used to the television. Suddenly, the relatability effect shifted. You weren't just a passive observer of the news, you were a participant. But this wasn't the freewheeling, anonymous internet of our 1990s. The copper web was built by the government, for the government. Every telepacket was recorded on a physical punch card and stored in the Grand Archive in Maryland. From the very first day, the internet wasn't a tool of liberation. It was the foundation of the I. The sense of privacy that defined the mid-20th century in our world began to evaporate decades earlier. You were no longer just a citizen. You were a data point in a glowing, orange-lit machine. Chapter 3. The Federal Data Exchange and the Early Social Feed. By the early 1960s, the Federal Data Exchange had expanded into the first version of social media. It was called the Common Link. Imagine a Twitter-style feed, but instead of images and videos, it was a scrolling stream of short, typed messages displayed on a tiny, circular green radar screen. During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the world didn't wait for a special report from a news anchor. They watched the crisis unfold in real time on the Common Link. Every move of the Soviet ships, every heated exchange in the UN, was broadcast as a status pulse. But there was a catch. Because the network was monitored, the digital purge of information happened in seconds. If you posted something that challenged the official narrative of the crisis, your terminal would simply go dark. The tension of the Cold War was amplified 1,000-fold because the information was instant, but the truth was controlled. This created a unique, emotional anchor for the generation, a constant, vibrating anxiety. You knew everything that was happening, but you knew that the eye was watching you watch it. The internet didn't bring the world together. It turned the entire planet into a high-stakes, black-and-white interrogation room. Part 2. The Summer of Servers and the Digital Purge. Chapter 4. The Counterculture of the Copper Web. As the 1960s dawned, the Federal Data Exchange had moved beyond the confines of military bunkers and into the heart of American culture. In our timeline, the 60s were defined by the music of the Beatles, the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., and a general sense of rebellion against the establishment. But in this world, that rebellion was digital. The youth of the 1960s didn't just have protest signs and pirate radio. They had the underground nodes. Imagine a coffee house in Greenwich Village in 1964. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of roasted beans, but the sound isn't just a folk singer with an acoustic guitar. It's the rhythmic, percussive clatter of a repurposed teletype machine in the corner. This was the birth of the hacktivist, young programmers, many of whom had learned their craft in the military or at universities, began to find backdoors into the government's copper web. They created dark feeds, unmonitored streams of information where they shared banned poetry, civil rights manifestos, and instructions on how to bypass the state's punchcard filters. The relatability effect here is striking. Just as we use social media today to organize movements, the youth of 1964 were using bulletin boards made of physical magnets and copper wire. But the stakes were much higher. In our world, a controversial post might get you canceled. In the 1960s of this timeline, a subversive pulse sent through the Federal Data Exchange could lead to a knock on the door from the FBI within the hour. The internet didn't just give the counterculture a voice. It gave the government a map of exactly who the rebels were. Chapter 5. The Summer of Servers. By 1967, the world was vibrating with a new kind of energy. History calls our 1967 the Summer of Love, but in this reality, it was the Summer of Servers. The first grid festivals were held, where thousands of young people gathered not just for music, but to sync up. They brought portable, suitcase-sized terminals, massive, heavy boxes powered by car batteries, and plugged them into public telephone jacks to create temporary, decentralized networks. Imagine San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, but instead of just psychedelic art, the walls are covered in ticker tape printouts of global data. The analog feed had become a psychedelic experience in itself. Artists began to experiment with code art, using the flickering green screens of vacuum tube monitors to create mesmerizing patterns of light and data. This was the first time humanity felt the addictive pull of the screen. People began to spend more time staring at the glowing tubes of their terminals than at each other. The information high was more potent than any drug. But beneath the surface of the Summer of Servers, a darker reality was taking shape. The government had realized that the common link was becoming too powerful to control through simple censorship. They needed something more total. They began to implement the Citizen Index, the first digital social credit system. Every time you logged into a terminal, your loyalty score was updated based on the keywords in your telepackets. If your score dropped too low, your access to the network was throttled, your bank credit was frozen, and your name was moved to the watch list. The dream of a digital utopia was being quietly dismantled by the very infrastructure that made it possible. Chapter 6. The 1968 Digital Purge. The tension reached a breaking point in 1968. In our timeline, this was a year of global upheaval. The Tet Offensive, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and the riots at the Democratic National Convention. In this world, 1968 is remembered for the digital purge. As the anti-war movement began to use the copper web to coordinate a massive, nationwide strike, the government decided to pull the plug. On a Tuesday night in August, the Great Disconnect happened. At exactly 8 p.m., the Federal Data Exchange went silent. Across the country, millions of glowing green screens flickered and died. The hum of the vacuum tubes ceased. For the first time in 15 years, the world was truly quiet. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a tactical blackout. For 48 hours, the government moved to arrest every major node master and link leader whose location had been tracked through the network. When the copper web was finally turned back on, it was unrecognizable. The underground nodes were gone. The common link had been replaced by the official pulse, a one-way stream of state-approved information. This was the moment the eye truly opened. The government had proven that it didn't just monitor the internet, it owned it. The emotional anchor for the people of 1968 was a profound sense of betrayal. They had been given a window into a wider world, only to have it slammed shut and replaced with a mirror that only showed them what the state wanted them to see. Chapter 7: The Portable Illusion and the Rise of the Kiosk. In the aftermath of the Purge, the 1970s saw a shift in technology that felt like progress, but was actually a more sophisticated form of control. This was the era of the kiosk society. Since the government had banned private, high-powered terminals, they replaced them with public information kiosks on every street corner. These were beautiful, mid-century modern structures of chrome and plastic, promising knowledge for all. Imagine a 1972 New York City where everyone carries a pulse card, a thick, plastic card with a magnetic strip. You walk up to a kiosk, slide your card, and get your daily ration of news, weather, and approved messages. It felt modern. It felt efficient. But it was the ultimate tool of surveillance. The kiosk knew who you were, what you were looking for, and who you were talking to. The relatability effect for a citizen of the 70s was a strange kind of comfort. They felt connected to the world, but it was a curated, sanitized connection. This was also the era of the first mobile terminal, a device the size of a briefcase that allowed elite citizens to access the network from their cars or offices. It was the ultimate status symbol of 1975. But even these mobile devices were tethered to the state's mainframes. The Silicon Revolution of our world, which was starting to produce the first truly personal computers like the Altair and the Apple I, was suppressed in this timeline. The government didn't want people to have computing power at home. They wanted them to have access terminals. The distinction was everything. In our world, the computer became a tool for the individual. In this world, the terminal remained a leash for the state. Part 3: The Silicon Curtain and the Age of the Mainframe Gods. Chapter 8: The Silicon Curtain and the 1980s Cyber Freeze. As we enter the 1980s in this timeline, the world has become a place of silent, invisible borders. In our history, the 80s were a neon-soaked decade of globalization, the rise of the personal computer, and the beginning of the end for the Iron Curtain. But in a world where the internet has been a tool of state control for 30 years, the Silicon Curtain has become far more impenetrable than any wall of concrete and barbed wire. The copper web has evolved into a global grid of control, where the flow of information is as strictly regulated as the flow of oil or gold. Imagine the atmosphere of 1982. The neon signs of the cities still flicker, but they are no longer just advertisements. They are sensors. Every street lamp, every shop window, and every transit station is integrated into the national grid. The fear of a nuclear flash has been replaced by a more subtle, pervasive dread, the fear of delisting. In this world, the greatest threat to your survival isn't a bomb. It's having your data packet deleted by the central mainframe. If you don't exist in the Federal Data Exchange, you don't exist at all. You can't buy food, you can't work, and you can't travel. This is the ultimate emotional anchor of the era, a world of high-tech efficiency built on a foundation of absolute digital obedience. Chapter 9: The Evolution of the Citizen Index. By 1984, a year that feels much more like Orwell's vision than in our own timeline. The Citizen Index we discussed earlier has reached its terrifying perfection. It is no longer just a watch list. It is a fully automated social credit system. Every interaction you have with the network affects your score. Did you spend too much time reading external reports? Did you communicate with someone whose loyalty score is lower than yours? The logic engines know. The relatability effect here is haunting because it mirrors our modern concerns about algorithms, but amplified by 40 years of state-sponsored development. Imagine your social status being determined by the hum of a vacuum tube computer in a bunker you will never see. There is no social media for fun. Your profile is a government record that determines the quality of your life. In the 1980s of this world, people don't strive for wealth. They strive for data purity. High-scoring citizens are rewarded with bandwidth privileges, faster connection speeds to the state's entertainment feeds, and access to the few remaining luxury goods. The internet has successfully turned the entire population into a self-policing army of data points. Chapter 10. The Mainframe Gods, the Birth of Early AI. One of the most profound technological divergences in this timeline is the emergence of what we would call artificial intelligence, but realized through the sheer brute force of 1950s-era logic. Because microchips remained a suppressed technology, the government focused on building bigger and bigger electronic brains. By 1985, the mainframe gods were born. These were not the sleek AI programs of our 2026. They were subterranean complexes the size of small towns, housing millions of vacuum tubes and cooled by diverted underground rivers. These mainframe gods became the true rulers of the world. They didn't just monitor data. They began to predict behavior. They managed the global economy, optimized the distribution of rations, and directed the movements of the military with a cold, mathematical certainty that no human leader could match. The pattern break. Here is the realization that the leaders of the US and the USSR were no longer making the decisions. They were merely the mouthpieces for the logic loops generated by their respective mainframes. The world was locked in a digital chess match where the players were machines and the pawns were billions of human lives. This is the era of automated destiny, where the future was no longer something to be built, but something to be calculated. Chapter 11. The Digital Cold War and the Logic Wars. In our world, the 1980s saw the peak of the arms race, with Reagan's Star Wars program threatening to move weapons into space. In this timeline, the logic wars were fought entirely within the copper web. The goal wasn't to destroy the enemy's cities, but to crash their mainframe. Espionage didn't involve secret agents in tuxedos. It involved signal officers trying to inject a dead loop into the enemy's vacuum tube network, a primitive but lethal form of computer virus that could cause millions of glass tubes to shatter simultaneously through thermal overload. Imagine the tension of a digital blackout. If the Soviet mainframe successfully glitched the American grid, entire cities would go dark. Not just the lights, but the very systems of life, food distribution, heating, and communication. This created a new kind of warfare, attrition by information. The two superpowers were constantly probing each other's firewalls, looking for a single unshielded copper wire or a disgruntled technician. The world lived in a state of permanent electronic alert, where a single surge of high-voltage interference could signal the start of a global collapse. The internet hadn't brought peace. It had just made war invisible and instantaneous. Chapter 12. The 1980s Home Terminal, a Leashed Revolution. By the end of the decade, the government began to allow a new version of the home terminal, but it was a far cry from the personal computers of our world. These devices, known as access blocks, were designed to be part of the furniture, sleek, wood-paneled boxes with built-in screens and heavy, mechanical keys. They were sold as a miracle of modern living, allowing families to connect with the national grid from their living rooms. But the access block was the ultimate Trojan horse. It was a two-way mirror. For the first time, the eye was inside the home. Every keystroke was a data point for the citizen index. The information age had reached its final stage of domestic penetration. People spent their evenings browsing state-approved encyclopedias or watching pulse movies sent directly from the central nodes. There was a sense of awe at the technology, but it was coupled with a silent, unspoken understanding. The terminal was a guest that never slept and never stopped reporting. As we move into the 1990s and toward the modern era of today, the question isn't whether we can escape the network, but whether we even remember what it was like to be alone. Part 4. The Stagnation of 2026 and the Retro-Digital World. Chapter 13. The Great Consolidation. As the calendar turned toward the year 1990, the world did not experience the joyful collapse of borders or the birth of a decentralized World Wide Web that we remember from our history. Instead, the final decade of the 20th century was marked by what historians in this timeline call the Great Consolidation. In our world, the 90s were about the democratization of information. Anyone with a modem could carve out a piece of the digital frontier. But in a world where the internet was born from the military-industrial complex of the 1950s, the 1990s were the years the frontier was finally closed for good. The state realized that the decentralized underground nodes of the past could only be defeated by a total integration of all local networks into a single, global oracle. This was the end of the copper web and the birth of the deep grid. Imagine a world where the internet didn't become a collection of billions of individual websites, but a single, massive, state-operated operating system that governed every aspect of human existence. By 1995, the centralization decree made it illegal to operate any logic engine that was not hardwired into the national mainframe. The relatability effect here is chilling. Imagine if every time you opened your browser, you weren't visiting a site, but simply logging into a government terminal that already knew exactly what you were looking for and why. Chapter 14. The Miniaturization Wall and the Death of the Microchip. One of the most striking differences you would notice in the 2020s of this reality is the sheer bulk of technology. In our world, the relentless drive for profit and innovation led to the microchip, a miracle of silicon that allowed us to put more computing power in a pocket-sized phone than was used to land men on the moon. But in this alternate timeline, the mainframe gods, those town-sized logic engines we discussed earlier, made a cold, calculated decision. They determined that the widespread availability of high-powered, portable computing would lead to a loss of state control. As a result, the development of the microprocessor was deliberately suppressed. Scientists were redirected to focus on nanotubes, microscopic glass vacuum tubes that were incredibly fast but generated immense heat. This created what is known as the miniaturization wall. Because the technology requires massive cooling systems and high voltage power, personal computing, as we know it, simply does not exist. If you were living in 2026 in this world, you wouldn't own a laptop or a tablet. Your home would have a stationary access block, a heavy, wood and steel terminal built into the wall of your apartment, cooled by the building's central water system. The devices are beautiful in a brutal, industrial way, glowing with a soft orange light, but they are stationary leashes. You don't take your technology with you. Your technology waits for you at home, reporting your every absence to the central grid. The world is high-tech in its capability, but retro-digital in its physical form. It is a world of heavy copper, glowing glass, and the constant, low-frequency hum of a planet that is permanently plugged in. Chapter 15. Living in the Glass Cage of Today's World. What does it actually like to walk the streets of a city in this timeline? Imagine a place like London or New York, where the architecture of the 1950s has been preserved and reinforced with layers of sensors. There are no smartphones. You don't see people walking down the street looking at their palms. Instead, people wear wrist links, thick, metallic bracelets that pulse with light whenever the state needs to send a directive. These links don't have screens. They are biometric trackers that monitor your heart rate, your location, and your proximity to other citizens. Privacy is not just a forgotten concept. It is an illegal one. Every conversation in a public park, every whispered word in a cafe, is captured by acoustic nodes hidden in the lampposts and routed back to the mainframe gods. But here is the emotional anchor of this world. Most people don't mind. Because the network manages the distribution of food, the timing of the transit systems, and the safety of the streets with mathematical perfection, the population has traded their liberty for a strange, hollow kind of convenience. You don't have to worry about finding a job. The logic engines assign you one based on your childhood data. You don't have to worry about who to marry. The compatibility pulse suggests the perfect partner to ensure the stability of the grid. It is a world where the anxiety of choice has been replaced by the comfort of the script. But look closer at the faces of the people on the street. There is a data fatigue in their eyes, the look of a humanity that has become a mere extension of the machines they built to serve them. Chapter 16: The Silent Rebellion and the Modern Map. Despite the total control of the deep grid, a silent rebellion persists in today's shadows. These are the ghost nodes, people who have learned to live off the grid by using forgotten copper wires from the 1950s or by building analog bunkers shielded by lead paint. They communicate not through data packets, but through physical data drops, handwritten notes, and mechanical ticker tape passed in the dark. They are the only people who remember what it feels like to have a thought that isn't being recorded. The modern map of the world is a series of data fortresses. The superpowers, the US, the Eurasian Pact, and the Pan-Asian Bloc, no longer fight over territory, but over bandwidth. The wars of 2026 are fought in the unseen layers of the fiber optic cables that cross the ocean floor. Every nation is trying to dampen the logic of its rivals, hoping to cause a systemic collapse that would leave the enemy's population blind and disconnected. As we look at this world, we have to realize that the internet didn't bring us the global village we were promised. In this timeline, it brought us a global panopticon. It started with a vacuum tube in 1950 and ended with a humanity that is just a series of pulses in a cold, metallic heart. We thought we were building a brain for the world, but we ended up building a cage. Thank you for following this deep dive into the information age that might have been. The retro-digital world of today is a testament to how the same technology can lead to either ultimate freedom or total control, depending on who holds the copper wires. Now, I want to hear from you. In a world where the state provides perfect safety and convenience at the cost of total surveillance, would you stay on the grid for the comfort, or would you risk everything to become a ghost node in the shadows? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.